Listen to that steel. That heavy, solid thunk is the sound of a car door on a 1950s automobile, a 1957 Chevy Bel Air, a 55 Buick Century, a Ford Thunderbird, and it is the sound of American steel from a time when the word disposable was not in our vocabulary. I have been turning wrenches my whole life as a master mechanic, and I can tell you, nobody pours steel into a car like that anymore. Today, if your car crosses 100,000 miles, you start shopping for a trade-in. But back then, the men building these machines were not building for a lease. They were building something a man would drive for 30 years and then hand down to his son. In this one, I want to take you inside the metal, into the real reasons these old tanks refused to die. The honest truth about that famous steel and one forbidden ingredient, now banned, that genuinely helped these engines run almost forever. Some of what you have been told about this is true, some of it is a fairy tale, and I am going to give you both, straight the way a mechanic sees it. So stick with me, because the answer is not quite the one the internet likes to sell you. Back then, an engineer did not have a supercomputer telling him the exact minimum amount of metal he could get away with, so he guessed, and then he guessed heavy. If he figured a bracket needed to be 1/4 of an inch thick to be safe, he made it 1/2 an inch just in case. They called it the safety factor, and they piled it on everywhere. The frame under one of these cars is a pair of steel rails you could stand on. The body panels are thick enough that a door feels like it was borrowed off a bank vault. Nobody was trying to save £1/2 to help the fuel economy because gas was cheap and nobody cared. So the whole car was built with a kind of margin, an extra helping of metal that we simply do not put into a modern car. That part of the legend is real. These things were genuinely overbuilt. Whether it was a Chrysler 300, a Bel Air, or a Thunderbird, they all came out of the factory wearing that same armor of extra steel. Now here's where I have to be honest with you, because I love these old cars too much to lie about them. A lot of people will tell you the steel itself was some kind of magic, that the metal in a 1950s Buick was secretly stronger than anything we have today. That part is not really true, and I will tell you why. Modern steel is actually a marvel. Pound for pound, the advanced high-strength steel in a new car is stronger and tougher than anything they poured back then. The difference was never that the old steel was better. The difference was that they used a lot more of it in much thicker sheets, and they built it a different way. An old car is body on frame, a heavy separate steel ladder with the body sitting on top, and you can feel that mass in every door. A modern car is mostly unibody, where the whole shell works together, lighter on purpose and engineered to crumple and absorb a crash instead of just sitting there like an anvil. Thickness, not some lost secret recipe, is what gives that old fender its heft. So when your grandfather says they do not make them like they used to, he is right. But not because the metal was magic. It is because they used twice as much of it and never worried about the weight. And now let me give you that forbidden ingredient I promised you, because this one is real, and most folks have never had it explained to them properly. The secret is lead, not in the body, in the fuel, and in the finish. For decades, gasoline had a compound called tetraethyl lead mixed right into it. It raised the octane rating and stopped the engine from knocking, but it did something else that mattered even more for the life of the engine. Think about what happens inside a running motor. The exhaust valve slams shut against its seat thousands of times every single minute. White-hot metal hammering on metal. Without protection, those two surfaces actually start to micro-weld together and tear apart on every cycle, slowly chewing the valve seat to pieces. That lead in the gasoline left behind a fine coating on the valve seats, a soft cushion that lubricated that hammer blow and kept the metal from eating itself. Those old engines, those big V8 engine blocks, the small block V8s that powered everything from the Bel Air to the Corvette, were designed around that lead. It was their built-in protection. And lead was in the paint too, and in the primers they coated the bare steel with. Lead-based coatings were some of the toughest rust fighters ever put on metal, so between the fuel protecting the engine and the coatings protecting the body, lead was quietly holding these cars together from the inside and the outside both. So why do I call it forbidden? Because we banned it, and we were absolutely right to. Lead is a poison. Tetraethyl, lead in the gasoline, was pumping lead into the air of every city in America, into the lungs and the blood of children, and it did real permanent harm to an entire generation. Congress phased it out through the Clean Air Act in the 1970s, and it was fully out of American pump gas by 1986. The lead paint was poisoning people too. Getting the lead out of our fuel and our paint is one of the great public health victories of the last century, and I would not undo it for anything. But I will be straight with you as a mechanic. When they took the lead out, a lot of those old engines started suffering what we call valve seat recession, the very wear the lead had been preventing. That is why, if you run one of these older engines today, you either need hardened valve seats installed or you add a lead substitute to your tank. The protection is gone, so you have to put it back another way. That is your first real tip if you own one of these survivors. Now here comes the part that is going to sting a little, because it is the biggest myth of all, and I would be a liar if I skipped it. People look at a gorgeous 1955 Survivor at a car show and they think, see, they built them to last forever, they never rusted. Friend, that is backwards. These cars rusted terribly. Awful. Worse than almost anything you can buy today. They had no galvanized steel, no modern rust proofing, no protective undercoating from the factory worth a dime. Park one in Michigan or Ohio where they salt the roads in winter. And within 7 or 8 years, the fenders were turning to brown lace and the floor pans were rotting out from under the driver. The vast majority of the cars built in that decade rusted into oblivion and were hauled to the scrapyard a long, long time ago. So why does it feel like they all lasted forever? 2 words: survivor bias. The only ones you ever see today are the handful that got lucky. The ones that lived in dry states like Arizona or California where there is no road salt. The ones that some proud owner kept in a heated garage and babied for 60 years. The ones that got fully restored. You are looking at the winners of a brutal contest and forgetting the millions that lost it. That gorgeous survivor is not proof they all lasted. It is proof that one of them did because somebody loved it. But here is the thing, and this is the real heart of it. The part that actually is true about why these machines are still on the road. It is not the steel, it is the simplicity. Pop the hood on a 1950s car, a Bel Air, a Thunderbird, a Corvette, and you can see the ground underneath it. There is a carburetor, a distributor, points, a coil, and a big simple V8 engine block, and that is about it. There is no computer. There are no dozens of sensors. There is nothing on that engine that a man with a basic set of tools, a manual, and a Saturday afternoon cannot understand, diagnose, and fix in his own driveway. When something breaks, you can actually get to it, and the part is simple and cheap and often still being made. Carburetor acting up? You can take it apart on your kitchen table, clean it, and put it back together. Points burned out? $1 part in 10 minutes. No dealership, no computer, no appointment 3 weeks out. I have watched men keep one of these engines alive for 50 years on nothing but a wrench, a screwdriver, and a little patience. That is the true secret of the eternal car. It was not that it never broke, it was that any competent person could always fix it forever with hand tools. A machine you can always repair never has to die. Compare that to a car today. When the check engine light comes on now, you are not reaching for a wrench. You are plugging in a computer And half the time the fix is a $500 electronic module you cannot even open, sealed at a factory across the ocean. A modern car will genuinely outlast an old one in normal driving. It will not rust, and it is far safer in a crash, and I want to be fair about that. But when it finally does go down, it goes down in a way the average person simply cannot fix. The old car is immortal because you can heal it. The new car is disposable because you cannot. That is exactly why you are hearing so much these days about what people call the right to repair. A whole movement of folks fighting for the simple idea that if you bought the thing, you ought to be allowed to fix the thing. Your grandfather never needed a movement for that. It was just how a car worked. And that word disposable brings me to the last piece, and this one is pure Detroit, because Detroit invented it. There was a man at General Motors named Alfred Sloan, and back in the 1920s, he came up with an idea that changed everything. Instead of building one good car and leaving it alone, like Henry Ford did with the Model T, Sloan decided General Motors would change the styling every single year. A new grille, new chrome, new tail fins, a new look, so that the car in your driveway would feel old and embarrassing next to this year's model, even if it ran perfectly fine. He built a whole department for it inside General Motors, the art and color section, which was formally established in 1927, and put his star designer, Harley Earl, in charge of making each year flashier than the last, on purpose, to make you unhappy with a car that was working just fine. Sloan politely called it dynamic obsolescence, and he laid the whole strategy out years later in his famous book, My Years with General Motors. His critics gave it the name we all use now. A designer named Brooks Stevens went around the country in the 1950s actually giving speeches defending the idea and calling it by its real name, planned obsolescence, instilling in the buyer the desire to own something a little newer, a little sooner than he needs to. And it worked so well it buried Ford and took over the whole industry. So think about what that really means. The very same Detroit that built these overbuilt tanks also invented the art of making you throw away a perfectly good one. The car did not have to die. They just needed you to want a new one. That started with chrome and tail fins, and it has grown into the world we live in now, where the thing is sealed shut, run by software, and quietly designed so that fixing it costs more than replacing it. The tail fin became the software update. Same trick, nicer suit. Because back in that era, whatever tricks the salesman played, there was still a real pride down on that factory floor. The man who bolted your Buick together felt that it carried his name in a way, that it was a piece of honest American work meant to be driven hard and passed down. The car was a handshake, and I think that is what people are really chasing when they fall in love with these old survivors. Not the steel, not even the styling. The honesty of a machine that showed you exactly what it was made of and let you keep it running with your own two hands. So if you have got one of these old survivors out in the barn or under a tarp, here is my straight advice as a mechanic. Keep it simple and it will outlive you. Treat the rust before the rust treats you, because that is what actually kills these cars, not the engine. Run a lead substitute or put in hardened valve seats so those old valves keep their cushion. And do not let anybody talk you into thinking the magic was in some lost steel. The magic was that a regular person could always fix it. And that is a kind of magic we gave away. Now I want to hear from you, and I mean this. If you have got an eternal survivor still running, tell me down in the comments what it is and how many miles are on that clock. I want to know who out there has the oldest one still on the road, because I will bet some of you are past 300,000 and still going. And if you liked hearing it straight from a mechanic instead of a fairy tale, stick around the archive, because there is a whole garage full of these stories. Take care of yourself, and I will see you on the next one.